Look, if you're in tech, you've heard this a million times. But, in the age of AI, its meaning has been totally flipped on its head. So today, we're going to dive deep into the myth versus the reality of data as a strategic moat.
Aha, there it is. Data is the new oil. I mean, for years, this simple phrase has been the fuel for Silicon Valley, right? It implies scarcity, it implies value, immense power. But what if it's just wrong?
And you've got to admit, it sounds so compelling, right? It makes just hoarding data seem like the only way to win, the only path to market dominance. But today, we're putting that whole idea under the microscope. Because here's the thing about AI. Data isn't always a fortress. Sometimes it's powerful, sure. Sometimes it's totally irrelevant. And yeah, sometimes it's just a flat-out distraction.
So this all brings us to the big question, the core of what we're talking about today. Is data actually the defensible advantage everyone claims it is, especially in this new world of AI? Or has the story, the narrative, just gotten way ahead of the actual reality? All right, here's our game plan for how we're going to break this all down. First, we're going to redefine what a moat really is. Then we'll bust that data moat myth wide open. After that, we'll build it back up with the 4 properties of a real data defense, look beyond data to some other power levers, and then we'll wrap it all up with a playbook for founders and investors.
Okay, first things first. We have to be super clear with our words here. A moat isn't just about having something valuable. No, it's about having something that is structurally, fundamentally defensible. And trust me, that distinction is absolutely crucial.
And this right here, this is the key. A real moat isn't just about having an advantage today. It's about an advantage that gets stronger and stronger over time, that locks your customers in, and that compounds in value. Anything less than that? Well, it's just a temporary edge. You see how this simple shift in how you look at it just changes everything? The question you should be asking isn't, is our data valuable? No, it's, is our data defensible and compounding? And believe me, those are 2 very different questions.
All right, so now let's tackle this myth head-on. For a long time, machine learning followed a really simple logic, but the game, it has completely changed.
So the old logic was pretty simple. Get more data, you get better models. And you know what? For a while, that was basically true. But now you have these massive foundation models that have basically eaten the entire internet. And that's created a new, incredibly high starting point for absolutely everyone.
Think about it. A few years ago, saying you scraped 10 million web pages, that was a big deal. Today, that's just the price of admission. It's the ante to even get in the game. Why? Because the big models have already swallowed all that data. So it's not an advantage anymore, it's just table stakes.
So let's be blunt here. If your data is public, if it can be scraped easily, if it's just sitting there, static, you don't have a moat. If it doesn't get better as more people use your product, you don't have a moat. And if your competitor can just go out and replicate it tomorrow, you definitely, absolutely do not have a moat today. Okay, so we've busted the myth. Now let's build the new reality. What actually turns a simple puddle of data into an impenetrable fortress? Well, it all comes down to 4 key properties.
So first up, proprietary access. This is data that's generated uniquely by your platform. Think about the data Google gets from your searches. You just can't scrape that. Second, you need a continuous feedback loop. Waze is like the perfect example of this, right? More drivers on the road means better real-time traffic data, which in turn attracts even more drivers. It's a beautiful cycle. Third is high labeling quality. In medicine, for instance, a set of accurately labeled X-rays is way more valuable than a million random images from the internet. And finally, number 4, embedded workflow data. Honestly, this is the holy grail. If your tool is the place where people do their actual work, you're capturing unique, contextual data that makes your product incredibly, incredibly hard to replace.
But look, even a fantastic dataset doesn't just exist in a vacuum. To really get its true power, we have to look beyond the data itself to other critical levers in the AI value chain, things like compute power and distribution.
And this table here lays out a really crucial distinction. See, down at the foundation model layer, think about the giants like OpenAI building the next version of GPT. Down there, compute is king, period. Having access to tens of thousands of GPUs is the real barrier to entry. It's a moat that's so expensive, almost nobody can cross it. But as you move up the stack to the application layer, where you're solving a very specific problem for a specific user, the tables completely turn. That's where your special proprietary data becomes your ace in the hole.
And this brings us to a kind of a hard truth, which is that distribution often just straight up beats data. I mean, think about it. A startup could have the most brilliant model in the world, but with no users, it's going to fail. But a company like, say, Salesforce or Microsoft, they can roll out a good enough AI feature to literally millions of their existing customers overnight. That is the raw power of distribution. If you own that customer relationship, you own the ultimate pipeline for generating new, valuable, proprietary data.
So this is really the core idea here. The real moat isn't the data you have today. It's the access that generates the data of tomorrow. Access to users, access to their workflows, access to customers, that's the real engine of a defensible business.
Okay, so what does all this mean in the real world, in practice? Let's translate this into a really actionable playbook, both for founders and for investors. These are the questions you absolutely need to be asking.
All right, founders, you need to be really honest with yourselves here. What unique data are you actually generating? Does your product genuinely get better with every single new user? Are you so deeply embedded in your customer's workflow that leaving you would be a total nightmare for them? If the answer to those questions is no, then you probably have a feature, not a moat. And for all the investors out there, your job is to really interrogate the data story you're being told. How exclusive is this dataset, really? How quickly could a well-funded competitor come along and replicate it? Does it actually compound? Does it get better over time in a way that creates real compounding returns? Look, those surface-level claims about "we have a lot of data" just aren't good enough anymore.
Let's just cut to the chase. Here's the bottom line. Data only becomes a moat when it is exclusive, when it improves with usage, when it's embedded in workflows, when it creates high switching costs for your customers, and when it compounds over time. If it doesn't check those boxes, you're not holding a strategic asset. You're just holding inventory.
And if you remember one thing, let it be this. This is the single most important takeaway from this entire explainer. Data all by itself, it's a commodity. But data that's part of a self-reinforcing system, a flywheel of user engagement, product improvement, and workflow integration, that is when it can become an incredibly powerful and truly defensible moat.
That whole new oil analogy is just flawed at its core, because oil is scarce and data, for the most part, is abundant. In this new age of AI, the real scarcity and therefore the real value, it comes from exclusive access, from compounding feedback loops, and from deeply embedded workflow intelligence.
So that leaves us with one final question for you to think about. When you look at your own industry through this new lens we've talked about, do you see a landscape that's rich with defensible proprietary data? Or do you see something that's way more commoditized than most people realize? The answer to that question, well, it could define the winners and the losers of the next decade.